Okay, so we're going to get into our next method of solving quadratic equations. We've now learned about the first two methods, which are solving by using square roots and solving by factoring. Today we're going to get into a brand new method called solving by completing the square. This method is very different than all of the other methods, but first we're going to start by just reviewing a certain type of factoring that we're going to need. In our do now, it says to factor the following trinomial and write your answer in two different ways. So looking at this problem here, I notice that this is a trinomial with three terms with an invisible a value of 1. So we know in this method of factoring that we can go right to our binomials, start them both with x, and then we ask ourselves what two numbers multiply to c, which in this case is positive 4, and also add to negative 4. Now, if we think about the factors of 4, the only factors of 4 are 1 and 4 and 2 and 2. So how can we multiply to positive 4 but add to negative 4? And that would be to use negative 2 and negative 2. Because negative 2 times negative 2 is 4, and negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4. So we'll go ahead and fill in both binomials with x minus 2 and x minus 2. So we've correctly factored this expression. But if you notice in the do now, it says to write your answer in two different ways. So we have to think about another way to write this answer. What I notice about this answer is I have the same binomial twice. Now I know that when I have the same thing being written twice, or the same thing that is being multiplied by itself, that I can write that one item, or in this case one binomial, and write it squared. So the second way that we can write this is to just write x minus 2 squared, because that means x minus 2 times x minus 2. So please keep in mind this type of factoring as we get into our lesson for today, because you're going to need it. So again, in our learning target, we see that we're going to still be solving quadratic equations using this brand new method called completing the square. So before we get into our lesson, you're going to need to be on page 7 of this lesson, but we're just going to watch this video to see a visualization of what's going on, because this method kind of has something to do with an actual square. So just to pause our video here, because we've never really used algebra tiles as a class, you'll notice that they took the expression x squared plus 4x plus 3. X squared is represented by the green square. The 4 x's are represented by each of those 4 yellow rectangles, and the positive 3 are represented by those 3 red tiles. So again, they have x squared plus 4x plus 3. So what you'll notice now in this method, since it's called completing the square, is they tried to visually arrange those algebra tiles into a square. So you'll notice that they tried to move them around, but there's something missing in the corner of the square. So what you'll notice is they represented the side length of both the top and the bottom as x plus 2 and x plus 2, because that represents the length and the width. The way you find the area is length times width, so that's x plus 2 times x plus 2, which they wrote as x plus 2 squared, but since they were missing that corner piece, they write x plus 2 squared minus 1, and that would be how you complete the square for this expression. Let's see another example. again, you'll notice they represented x squared plus 6x plus 15 with the algebra tiles, and they're going to try to arrange it into a square. So you'll notice in this problem, again, they represented the sides by x plus 3 times x plus 3, or x plus 3 squared, but this time, since they had extra algebra tiles left over, they wrote it as plus 6. So the way they completed the square was by writing it as x plus 3 squared plus 6. So again, this is just a visual representation of this method. Lucky for us though, we're not going to need to use these algebra tiles because we have steps that we're going to use to help us out. So again, you should be in your packet that says Solving Quadratic Equations Part 2, and we're looking at step 7. So looking at page 7, you'll notice that we give you steps on the left side here and an example on the right side. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk through these steps first. So it says to solve a quadratic of the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is equal to 1, by completing the square, and then we'll follow these steps. You'll notice that all the problems we're going to do are when a equals 1. If you notice down here, I talk about what happens when your a value is not 1. If this happens, which for us will really only be in some extension questions, you would try to divide everything by that a value to try to make it have no number out front. So let's take a look at these steps. Step number 1, it says, is to isolate the terms that have an x on the left side of the equation. So this step is a little different because you'll notice here that they started with the equation in standard form, but we actually don't want our equation in standard form. I'm just going to annotate that. We don't want it to be in standard form because it said I only want my terms that have an x to be on the left-hand side. So you'll notice that they took the 1 and they subtracted the 1 over to that right side. Notice that I left a space here where it says after the minus 6x. So let's see what that space is all about. Getting into step 2, it says take half of the b term, then square it, add that number to both sides of the equation. This step can be called half, square, share. So in this problem right here, you'll notice that our b term is -6. So I did step 2 right over here. I'm going to annotate this on the right side. This is step number 2. I take that b term, I take half, square, and share. So half of -6 is -3. -3 squared is 9. So I took half, I squared it, and I got 9, and now I'm going to share it, which means I'm going to add that number to both sides, because what I do to one side, I must also do to the other side. So in that step, I'm basically introducing a new number on both sides of the equation using half, square, share. Now we're up to step 3. Step 3 says to factor the left side and simplify the right side. So on the left side here, I have x squared minus 6x plus 3. So in this step here, it's a regular trinomial. I'll ask myself what number times itself gives us 9, and what number plus gives us -6. So if I think about the factors of 9, I have 1 and 9, and 3 and 3. But if I want to add to -6, I'm going to have to focus on those 3's, but I'm going to make them both negative, because -3 times -3 is 9, and -3 plus -3 is -6. So you'll notice that I factor to x minus 3 times x minus 3. What you're going to notice about completing the square is you're always going to get the same binomial twice. So what I want you to do, instead of writing it out twice, is just write it once and square it. So that's factoring the left side. Simplifying on the right side, that's pretty straightforward. -1 plus 9 just gives us +8. So at this point, we're left with x minus 3 squared equals 8. Looking at our steps, our next step here, it says is to take the square root of both sides. This is what we learned in our third lesson of this unit when we were trying to solve by using square roots. The way that we can get rid of the square is to take the square root of both sides. Notice that that makes the square go away and we're just left with x plus 3. And then the last step is to solve for x. So I just want to move that 3 over to the other side by adding 3. So you'll notice at this point that they got x equals plus or minus the square root of 8 plus 3. But just as an extra step here, remember, we always want to ask ourselves, can we simplify that square root at all? And in this case, I would think about the factors of 8. And since I know that 8 itself is not a perfect square, I can't simplify it right away. However, if I think about the factors of 8, I have 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. 4 is a perfect square, so I would factor this into the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, which is 2 square root of 2. So the final answer would be x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 2 plus 3. You'll notice in these notes here, I wrote it the same way, just in the opposite order. So again, the steps that you want to follow are written over here on the left side. Before we try the guided practice problems, I want you to think about this question right here. It says, how is the first step of this method different than when we were just factoring, which is what we did in the last 2 lessons? So I want you to think back to step 1 and how is this different? So again, the way that this form is different in the last 2 lessons when we were factoring, our first step was always to put it in standard form. However, you will notice that back at the beginning here, in this method, we don't want it to be in standard form. That is something that is special about the completing the square method. Let's go ahead and try the 2 guided practice problems. Again, if you're feeling like you're ready to try one by yourself, go ahead and pause this video and try these problems. So looking at the first problem, again, I'm going to go back and forth to my notes from the top of the page. The first step is to basically get it out of standard form. So only put the terms with an x on the left-hand side. I notice here that I want to move the 15 to the other side. So let's start by adding 15 to both sides. This will give us x squared plus 14x equals, and I know 0 plus 15 is 15. You're going to notice when I do this step, I always leave this sort of awkward blank space right here because I'm going to need that in step 2. Looking back at our notes, step 2 here, it says take half of the b term, then square it, add that number to both sides. This is called half square share. So in this method here, I take my b term, which is 14. I'm going to do this up down here off to the side. Taking half of 14 gives us 7. Squaring that gives us 49, and then I'm going to share that number on both sides. So I'm going to add 49 to both sides of my equation. Again, to go through that step one more time, I took my b term, which is 14, I took half, I squared it, and then I shared it. So now both sides have a 49. Now we're up to step 3 in our notes, which says to factor the left side and simplify the right side. In this problem here, going to factor the left side, again, I notice this is a regular trinomial. I can go right to my 2 binomials here, starting them both with x. Then I ask myself, what 2 numbers multiply to 49 but add to 14? Those 2 numbers would be positive 7 and another positive 7, because 7 times 7 is 49 and 7 plus 7 is 14. As I mentioned in the mini lesson, notice that you will always get the same binomial twice, so we're going to go ahead and write it once and square it. On the right side here, we need to just simplify this. 15 plus 49, if we use our calculator, gives us 64, so let's bring that down. Now we're up to step 4. If we come back to our notes, step 4 says to take the square root of both sides. So at this step right here, we're going to take the square root. Taking a square root of a square makes those cancel out, so we're left with x plus 7 equals. Now here, when we take the square root of 64, this is nice and straightforward. 64 is a perfect square. We know that the square root of 64 is positive or negative 8, so we can just write plus or minus 8. Now we're up to our last step here, looking at our notes, which says to solve for x. So nice and straightforward. We want to get the x by itself. We would do that by subtracting 7 on both sides. And now notice that we can have two different answers here. One of our answers will be positive 8 minus 7. Our other answer will be negative 8 minus 7. So our first answer will be 1, and our second answer will be negative 15. So both of these numbers make this equation true, and that is how we solve by completing the square. If you're feeling ready to try the second one by yourself, go ahead and pause this video and then come back to watch the answers for the second guided practice. Okay, so walking through these steps a little bit quicker this time, I'm going to first start by adding 1 to both sides. Again, notice I'm leaving that space in the middle. Step 2 is our half square share. So we're going to take our b term, which is negative 2. I'm going to take half of that, which is negative 1. I'm going to square it. Negative 1 squared is positive 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And then share it, meaning I'm going to add that 1 to both sides. Step 3 says to factor the left side and simplify the right side. So on the left side, I think about what two numbers multiply to positive 1 but add to negative 2. Now the only factors of 1 are 1 and 1, but if I want to add to negative 2, I would have to use negative 1 and negative 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1, but negative 1 plus negative 1 is negative 2. Again, in this step, you should always get the same binomial twice, which you can write as x minus 1 squared. Simplifying the right side, very straightforward. 1 plus 1 is 2. Now we're up to step 4, which is to take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root on the left side will just leave us with x plus 1. Now on the right side here, when we have the square root of 2, 2 is not a perfect square. The only factors of 2 are just 1 and 2, so I really can't simplify that any further. So I'm just going to write plus or minus the square root of 2. Our last step, step 5, is to solve for x. I'm going to go ahead and add 1 to both sides. So you'll notice here that the final answer that we get is positive or negative square root of 2 plus 1. Now you can leave your answer just like this. That's totally fine. If you want to write it out twice, you could write square root of 2 plus 1, and you could also write negative square root of 2 plus 1. But again, the shorter way of doing that is just by putting the plus or minus symbol. If you feel like you want to see a few more worked out examples, please go back to the Google Classroom and look at the Khan Academy links that I posted. They'll give you a little bit of extra help on this method of completing the square. At this point in the lesson, we're going to try our checkpoint question. So I'm going to ask that you take a piece of loose leaf paper. Please try this question because you'll need to submit your work on the checkpoint. Only come back to this video after you've tried it by yourself and you're ready to check your work. So looking at this checkpoint question, your first step should have been to subtract 8 on both sides. Step 2 is half squared share. So you take your b term, which was negative 6. You take half of that, which is negative 3. You square it, which is positive 9. And then you share it, meaning you add that number to both sides. Step 3 says to factor the left side. So here we're going to think about what are the factors of positive 9 that add to negative 6. And you should have used negative 3 and negative 3 because negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9 and negative 3 plus negative 3 is negative 6, which again, we want to write this just once squared. Simplifying the right side, negative 8 plus 9 will give us positive 1. Step 4 says to take the square root of both sides. So we're left with x minus 3. And on the right side, the square root of 1, nice and straightforward. The square root of 1 is just 1, so I'll write positive 1 or negative 1. Last step is to solve for x, so I'm going to add 3 on both sides. And now let's figure out our two answers. One answer is going to be 1 plus 3. The other answer is going to be negative 1 plus 3. So our first answer is positive 4. Our second answer is positive 2. So your two answers for the checkpoint should have been positive 4 and positive 2. So again, at this point in the lesson, I want you to think about how you did on this problem. looking at our directions for independent practice, if you were unable to solve this equation and you're really ready to just start with some simpler problems, you're going to start with questions 1 through 4 on page 8. If you got through some of those steps, but you feel like you still need to do a little more basic problems, you can start with yellow, which is to start with number 5. If you understand these steps and you're ready to tackle some more challenging questions, you can start in green. Again, to get your classwork credit for this lesson, if you're starting in red, you need to work on red and yellow. If you're starting in yellow, you need to work on yellow and green. And if you're in green, you need to work on green and the extension questions. Before you begin your independent practice, I want everyone to notice that you now know how to do 4 more problems in your Regents packet. So whether or not you're in red, yellow, or green, I would give a try to those 4 questions from the Regents packet since those pertain to this particular lesson. So right now, please pause this video, go take about 10 to 15 minutes to work on your independent practice, then come back to check your answers. Okay, so looking at our answers, here's page 8, numbers 1 through 6. Again, if this was a problem you did, feel free to pause the video so you can check your work. You'll notice that in all of these problems, 1 through 6, you had a nice perfect square. So notice I ended up with all nice integer answers. Here's the bottom of page 8, numbers 7 through 10. You'll notice here, just to point out, that in 8 and 9, I ended up still with a square root in my answer because neither 10 nor 26 were perfect squares. Similar thing happened in number 10, but the square root of 40 could be simplified further into the square root of 4 and the square root of 10, which should have given you 2 square root of 10. Again, that's called simplest radical form. Continuing on to page 9, here's numbers 11 and 12. These come from a Regents exam from last year. And moving to the bottom of page 9, here's numbers 13 through 16. So again, to get your credit for this lesson, we need you to submit to us through Google Classroom a picture of your checkpoint question as well as your work for the independent practice. Before you finish, you are now ready to do number 3 on your exit ticket. Again, you should have already done numbers 1 and number 2. Now you're ready to answer number 3. Please don't submit the exit ticket just yet. There's still 1 more problem that you'll have to do for a lesson that will be taught next week, but please try to answer number 3.